Once again, the news is filled with one seeming crisis after another, from chaos at the southern border to an allegation from the nation's top law enforcer that the government was spying on the Trump campaign and making sure more Detroiters can get online. We'll talk with the city's new director of digital inclusion. Today is Sunday, April 14th, 2019, and this is Flashpoint. Hi, welcome to Flashpoint on this April 14th. So perhaps you're working to get your taxes completed this morning, or maybe you're just holding off until tomorrow before sending the check for those taxes in. Still grumpy with the withholding tables, which were off for a lot of taxpayers this year. Whatever you're paying into the government coffers, you got to see your money at work this week. Government hearings, legal decisions, and maneuvers, threats, counter threats, and yep, your tax dollars actually pay for all of it. There was a lot to chew on this week, though once again, I'm fairly certain that few minds were changed as Americans just seem to dig more deeply into whatever burrow they've chosen. So Bill Barr's appearance on Capitol Hill was either a very clear and strong explanation of his take on the Mueller report, Obamacare, and spying on the Donald Trump campaign, as he put it, or it was a very worrisome showing by a man who seems to be less the United States Attorney General and more the president's personal lawyer. I heard very little in between this week. William Barr is either one thing or the other, it seems. We had the fight over the president's tax returns. We had what have become very entrenched battle lines on immigration and asylum seekers. And once again, I found myself thinking, if everything is a crisis, then maybe nothing is a crisis. We're going to talk about all that this morning. We're also going to talk about the city's efforts to bridge the digital divide. We're going to talk to the new Detroit Director of Digital Inclusion. And we're also going to start an occasional celebration of this program turning 20 years old. It's all today on Flashpoint. I have no idea if our country is full, as the president declared last week, but I do know the roundtable is. So with me this morning are Dennis Cowan, attorney from Plunkett Cooney, and the former mayor of Royal Oak. Portia Roberson, former attorney with the U.S. Justice Department, now the head of Focus Hope. Zoe Clark back with us again. She's the program director at Michigan Radio, and the former majority leader of the Michigan Senate, Randy Richardville. Thanks, gang, for being here. Portia, let me start with you. As we watched William Barr this past week, it was a stunning thing to hear an attorney general of the United States say there was spying going on a presidential campaign. And as I pointed out, I think there's a difference of opinion here over whether William Barr was saying the things as he sees them and as they should be said, or if he was acting more as the president's personal attorney rather than the attorney general. I have a hunch I know where you're going to go, but what did you think?
I am fascinated by the willingness of people to risk their reputation and their entire careers for Donald Trump. I am shocked by the fact that they are willing to put it all on the line to serve him in whatever capacity and come up with whatever he says to come up with and put that out there as that's the position they take. I mean, the Attorney General of the United States saying that there was spying going on in the department that he runs during the time that he's been there, or during the time of the previous person, but during the time of this administration, is incredible. It's incredible to watch. And it continues to happen with various people in the administration, with people who support him, that they just will risk it all for Donald Trump.
Let me move to the other attorney with us this morning. Dennis, to say this is what I think happened, I don't have any proof of it. Responsible? How did you feel about him saying that?
Well, first of all, he's the man on the hot seat right now since the Mueller report has come out.
Right.
As a result, he did, I think, an excellent job coming up to Congress and reminding them that they pass regulations that allow redactions for very good reasons, such as grand jury testimony and individuals who were not indicted at all, who maybe were questioned, but their names will be redacted, and of course classified material. As Portia said, there's been a lot of incredible things that have happened in the past 2 years. There's many of us on the Republican side who believe some of the incredible things happened at the FBI and the DOJ, and look at what has happened to those two institutions. Bill Barr has had this job before. I predict he said something he knows about, and I agree with Ken Starr. Stay tuned.
Well, but that's the frustrating aspect of all of this, I think.
I never get to talk anymore.
Anyway, I was
saying, right.
No, but I mean, so you dropped this word like spying, and then when the senators sort of were like, well, hold on, hey there, just a second, and said,
is that what you really mean to say?
Yes, and then it was, well, this is what's thought of, and it was like, oh, so there's the group that's invested. Well, no, there's not a group. These are concerns, right? And so the issue I think I have is like this idea of just kind of throwing the bomb in and then going, Okay, and that does feel a little Trumpian, right? Where you throw out some things with maybe necessarily facts that don't go along with it, and then it leads to a lot of folks like us sitting around and saying, well, what did he or doesn't he mean? When I think sometimes then the focus isn't on other important issues.
And the headline sticks no matter how that goes.
AG says
from
spying
here.
happened. Right, yeah.
Well, I don't know if we're ever going
to
to get to the bottom of this thing. It's been going on for seemingly years. How long ago was the election now? Or 2 years? 2 years plus? And we talk about this person spying. Today, with the technologies out there today, how can anybody be surprised that anyone's listening in on any conversation?
Apparently Alexa's
I was
hearing
going to say,
everything.
if they had an Alexa in the campaign, there was spying.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that. I mean, so I don't know what all the big deal is. I mean, I think it's a lot of talk, and at the same time, I don't know why there's people are surprised. But the FBI, is the FBI just investigating one side or the other? And I think that's part of the question.
This is an interesting thing to me, because now James Comey has become very vilified by the right. Don't you think there's a case to be made that if James Comey had not reopened the investigation of Hillary Clinton's emails 9 days before the election, that, I mean, didn't he do, wasn't that a finger on the scale as we were just heading to the election?
Oh, I'm sure that anyone that has some common sense will think that's possibly true. Yeah. But it's all opinions, you know. There's not a whole lot of facts being rolled out. And again, I've been investigated by the FBI, the Republican campaign committee, the Democrat campaign committee. They look to make sure we're doing things the right way. So whether something was happening that's wrong or not, I don't know. But I'm also a little bit concerned about getting the FBI and putting them behind, on trial. Because I want them to be doing their work to protect us and to protect our country. And I don't want everything they do to be out in front of every motive being questioned by this department or that department. So.
Well, and the little tidbit, of course, about the James Comey firing, right, is that Jared Kushner was actually one of the ones that came up with the plan and thought Democrats would actually not do anything about the firing because they would be happy because there was still anger.
Still anger over
and
him.
look how that turned out.
Yeah.
That was not quite how the end of the movie finished, but it's still an interesting note.
To other portions, Dennis, though, of his remarks that day, when he was asked about trying to abolish Obamacare, as the Justice Department is doing, he kind of seemed to take up the president's case and said, well, here's what the president wants to do on that. When he was asked about the opioid problem in America, he said, well, that's part of why we need a wall, which is taking up the president's case. And I think some people were troubled that seemed rather baldly political rather than an attorney general's behavior.
Well, those issues that he was talking about have been out there already, and certainly cabinet members are expected, on the most part, in the Obama administration, Bush, every administration I've seen, have come up.
Oh, I think Eric Holder was often criticized for the same thing, right?
I did not find his comments particularly partisan. I think he was being very straightforward. Remember, he was up there supposedly talking about his budget. Everybody tried to sideline him.
That's what this was supposed to be about.
He did I think some of the points he was trying to make were to try and get people focused on what he was up there for and what he was trying to get done, and quite frankly, some very important things that he's trying to do with the DOJ budget.
But I do want to point out, though, that during my time at the Justice Department, one of the things that I routinely had to tell friends at the White House or at other agencies is that the Department of Justice cannot do things at the will of the president if they're illegal things, right? So you can't just say, president just call and say, hey, I want you to do this, and the AG doesn't necessarily do those things. We have to have some separation between those things. So while I understand that cabinet members are asked questions and they speak about some of the things that are on the president's agenda, they may mention it. I think it's stepping over the line when you talk about saying why we need a wall or why we need to abolish health care. That's not really the role. To me, at this point, Obama's health care program is still legal. It's still in place. And he is supposed to execute that until something changes. That hasn't changed yet. So why is the AG bringing that out as what we need to do? He should be carrying forth the law as it's already written and not kind of commenting on what he thinks should be the next thing. The state of independence in those two.
How that worked during the Kennedy administration.
It may or may not have worked during the Kennedy administration with two brothers. I mean, I understand because of the president.
You're actually talking about.
Well, I mean, and listen, I'm not naive enough to believe that cabinet members, including the Attorney General, are never going to be asked or never end up speaking on a topic. But I think you have to be very careful about the line you might cross as an attorney when you start talking about what the president wants, at least at that level, because you want to make sure there is some sense of, for instance, with the Defense of Marriage Act, when that was still a legal thing, the Justice Department, we had to do the things that were necessary to carry that out. Now, whether Eric Holder agreed with it or not, whether the president already said he wanted to get rid of that, that's not relevant to whether or not we have to keep going with it.
I got a couple of minutes left with our segment here, and I wanted to bring it back closer to home. Zoe, the mayor, we saw, of course, we had two people charged in the demolitions thing,
Indeed.
which we've been watching that investigation. The other track of all this, though, is this now really interesting investigation into this nonprofit attached to Dr. Sonia Hassan, who may or may not be linked to the mayor. He's not wanting to answer questions about his private life, which I think it feels like a lot of most journalists in town have sort of allowed that, bought into that, especially since the statement from he and his wife. But when that becomes the central part of the investigation, were there favors here, can he continue to say, well, I'm not really interested in talking about that?
Well, I think whether or not there are favors is still sort of to be determined. I think the fact is, though, is that you now have these sort of points on a map, right, that have sort of started to link together in terms of that this woman is a woman who has been out doing this thing for this organization that she's been doing, and the fact that she got a grant from the city, and this is the mayor of this city. I mean, it depends on what we end up finding out about this relationship. But look, grant money is grant money, and we'll see where there are other organizations that were in line or that were looking for it. And there's still, I think there's still a lot in this story still that we need to better understand.
Nobody, Randy, would suggest that this isn't a noble cause to talk about trying to help Detroit moms take their babies to term. Obviously, prenatal health care, it's a terribly, but there's a lot of people, I imagine, standing around going, I got an important cause here too, and I'm able to get grant money. So is there anything to it, do you think?
It's hard for me to know those kinds of things. I don't know what's happening with the administration regarding this issue very well. So
it's hard to know.
Yeah, but I'm just not close to it. I'd rather not give an opinion on something I don't know about, which is weird for a politician.
Yes, it is. Quite weird.
But this is an area where I think a lot of people would rather stay out of it because it feels there's something icky about it. Watching these banners that Robert Carmack is running over the city, I think a lot of people find that very distasteful. A lot of the reporters I know in this very building have felt it, uncomfortable to cover that, and yet this is central to the issue, isn't it? Well,
and the fact that, he held this press conference a couple months ago.
Right.
He was going to expose all this stuff, and then he didn't, but then he, uses the helicopter or the plane to, fly around what he wanted to, I guess, say at the press conference. So it just gets sort of, mired in the gossipy form of things rather than allowing for whatever investigation. I know the IG is going to do an investigation. I think that there have been some asks from maybe the council members or someone else. And so I think the reality is you let that carry out and see what happens.
Well, two things. One, having been a mayor of a much smaller town, but nevertheless a mayor, we always get involved in helping support nonprofits in the community because they're very important to the social, cultural fabric of the community. So I think that
it's part of your bully pulpit.
Totally understand that. Whether or not there was any issue relative to this particular grant, there's grant guidelines, where the money came from, where it's going, and I think that'll all sort itself out. But something that happened very important last week, Moody's rated the 2020 Detroit budget as credit positive, including sound financial practices, conservative revenue assumptions, significant capital investment, and setting aside funds for the 2024 spike in pensions that's coming. As someone who worked with the Senate Majority Leader on the grand bargain, represented the foundations, this is very good news. And I think hopefully the mayor will not get distracted by this and keep up the good work with the council.
I'm really glad you got that in. Thanks, gang, for being here very much. We continue. We'll talk about the digital divide in Detroit on Flashpoint.
696 has reopened, making the Toyota of your dreams even more accessible. Experience the Gowling difference at the all-new Gowling Toyota in Warren, 696 in Van Dyke. Over 5 acres full of inventory featuring over 200 new and 75 certified and pre-owned vehicles built in the USA. Start shopping right now on GowlingToyota.com and get pre-approved without using your social security number. Then get to the all-new Gowling Toyota in Warren today.
The region is on the rise. Project after project, building, growing, innovating. We're building the future right now. Hard work matters here. IBEW Local 58 electricians and NECA signatory contractors bring commitment, pride, expertise, and passion to every job. It's our code of excellence. One vision, one team, one mission. to build the very best Michigan for all of us. Put us to work for you. The best contractors, the best electricians, period.
I just want to celebrate another day of living. I just want to celebrate another day of life.
Time to ride with Firekeeper's Life is a Highway RV giveaway Saturday, April 27th. Win a Jeep Wrangler Unlimited, one of 2 Coachman campers, or a luxurious Thor motor coach. Earn entries daily.
I just want to celebrate another day of life.
Tonight at 11, teens are selling nude pictures of themselves on social media.
I have 15 nude pictures that I'll sell you for $20.
Teenagers selling their private pics, making hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars a month. And parents have no idea.
There's no way to know.
The defenders expose what's going on, see how teens are getting paid, why it's so hard to know if your kids are doing it, and what parents need to know. Tonight on Local 4 News at 11, following an all-new Good Girls at 10.
Welcome back. I've noted before on this program that I believe information is the world's most precious and valuable resource. The haves tend to have access to lots of it, and the have-nots struggle to get access to any of it. Many Detroit residents live on the wrong side of the digital divide. The city is working to change it with the addition of a director of digital inclusion, just announced last week, and he is Joshua Edmonds, and he's with me now this morning. Joshua, good to have you on Flashpoint, and welcome to Detroit.
Thank you.
You've been here a little while now, though, enough time to start to get the lay of the land, but I imagine there's certain similarities in a lot of big cities in America that trying to overcome this ability to get digital technology and information technology in the hands of people who don't have it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm coming here from Cleveland, Ohio.
Right.
And Cleveland being a very similar city to Detroit in a number of ways, where we saw that we had a large population of our residents who did not have access to the internet, access to those devices, and really the know-how how to capitalize on those devices, and really being able to understand as we continue to look at things, for example, like Uber. We're like, oh, just call an Uber, just call an Uber. For us who have had access for quite some time, that's very easy. But for others, when we say Uber, that can actually be pretty daunting.
Yeah. And especially in a transportation challenged city like Detroit is, it's a massive thing to be able to have access to that. But do you find it's a bigger problem with the device, or is it a problem with the broadband and getting the, or do they just go hand in hand?
They go hand in hand. So whenever we look at the digital divide, it usually boils down to 3 things. We look at internet access, we look at devices, and we look at skills. And that usually is a hodgepodge of issues for people, or some it could just be, hey, just for me, it's the one thing. Typically with elderly populations, we see that they might have devices, maybe, but they'll say, oh, why do I need the internet?
Yeah.
I have the TV, that's where I get my information from. Why do I need the internet? And so while cost is usually a big barrier for a lot of people by way of poverty, relevance is another barrier, and that's what I'm trying to tackle as well.
Yeah. There's a lot of people thinking about this. You were doing this for the Cleveland Foundation. The Knight Foundation is paying your salary, which shows, I think, the way that they're thinking about this now that you're here in Detroit. But you come really without the ability to just start spending money. It's not like you have a budget. So what do you come in and do first?
The first thing I'm doing right now is building relationships. What I'm understanding is that the money is in Detroit. There is money here. We have a slew of businesses in Detroit who have the capital to make a difference. Mm-hmm. My thing right now, and it's very interesting to come from the foundation where we had so much money, and now, to your point, not to have any, what do you do? Well, again, it's building relationships, it's looking at our public-private partnerships and opportunities to really educate people on this digital divide and ways that they can get involved.
So that's what I was going to ask. When you approach people and start talking about the digital divide, do you get a sense that people grasp how enormous this is and what I was talking about earlier about the access to information?
No. I fundamentally believe that we need to do a lot more with educating those who are already connected of this divide.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot of things that we miss. We're not always thinking about some of the residents who are hardest hit by some of the decisions and how technology is changing our world. That's why, in coming here and having a mayor like Mayor Duggan who prioritizes the residents and making sure that this renaissance that everyone keeps talking about for Detroit, that we're actually able to streamline information into the neighborhood neighborhoods. And the best way to do that is with technology at this point. But what preempts technology is building those relationships with partners. And I would say that the city, making this effort to say, we want to host this digital or create this position, that's us saying now that we also want to value the partnerships and opportunities for partnership in the space.
I think all the time about what's happening with the cost of information technology. It's weird, when the first microwaves came out, they were really expensive, and now you can find one just about anywhere and they're really cheap. That has not happened yet with this phone. They keep getting more expensive. Digital access keeps getting more expensive. Prices keep going up. How do we address that for people who, never mind the entry point, they certainly can't handle then what happens when it keeps getting more expensive?
For sure, and I mean, and that's a great point, and that's actually the reason why there's the divide in the first place. That all it is a lot of profits that are being streamlined, and now we're paying more for things that a few years ago we really weren't paying for. And to that end, I think that is us as a community constantly making the case and showcasing that we can't move forward unless we're all moving forward together. That at some point, the internet being in excess of $60, $70 a month, that is just going to cut out a huge, and it already has cut out a huge population of our residents where they're not necessarily able to engage. What we're doing past just not giving people the opportunity to learn online, we're actually limiting the power of democracy. Because as we've seen that information is online, that is something that we can access and be politically engaged citizens. And if we're not taking advantage of those online opportunities or providing those opportunities to do so, we actually are weaker as a city because of that. And so I think that having that combined ass and having someone like the mayor who is a strong advocate for this, I think that then forces some of our other corporate partners to think about this in a different way.
Well, and the implications for education in the schools, of course, it's enormous. I'm so glad you're here, and I hope this is the first of many conversations we'll have you about it. Thanks very much for coming in, Joshua.
Absolutely, thank you.
Detroit. We come back, we'll start talking about the 20th anniversary of the program you're watching right now. This is Flashpoint on Local 4.
Autism doesn't discriminate. It affects all ethnic and socioeconomic groups. Early intervention is the key to healthy development and positive change. If you are looking for resources for your loved one, the DWMHA Autism Benefit Program helps those who are on the autism spectrum. Give the Detroit Wayne Mental Health Authority a call 24/7, 800-241-4949. Here to talk, here to help.
What is this? A text message from the Wayne County Treasurer's Office about my payment plan?
That's right. Our Project Text Message program allows you to enroll in our free text messaging service. All you have to do is provide your cell phone number. I'm here today with one of our customer service representatives, Karim Howe. She will explain how it works.
Our customer service team will send friendly reminders and text alert updates about your current payment plan. Everyone gets busy. We want to help you stay on track with your tax payments to avoid foreclosure. Call 313-224-5990 to enroll in our voluntary program. You will receive reminders on tax payment due dates and other important valuable information.
Join Project Text Message today by calling 313-224-5990 or email our office at textinfo@waynecounty.com. Stay in touch. Stay connected.
As the measles cases continue to rise,
this outbreak is moving really fast.
Local 4's own Dr. Frank McGeorge is here to keep you updated on the outbreak with information you can trust.
If you're exposed or potentially exposed, get vaccinated.
Local 4 in good health, keeping your family safe.
Your 4-zone forecast.
Winds gusting.
Flood watch in effect. It's going to be a windy day.
Finally today, if you've been a charter member of the Flashpoint family, that now means you've been with us for 20 years. We're celebrating a pretty proud anniversary of this program, and occasionally we're going to look back at some of the moments and personalities that have made us, thankfully, a staple of Sunday morning television in Detroit. One of those moments came 15 years ago when Flashpoint hosted the first real open and honest conversation about race at the Mackinac Policy Conference. Many felt it was groundbreaking for its candor, and it included moments like this from my friend and former colleague at Local 4, Emery King.
There comes a point, I think, and I'm speaking from the perspective of a 56-year-old man. There comes a point, for me, and I'm speaking for myself, where I get tired and impatient with having to explain certain things to white people. Right. So if you're, and I say this with all due respect to you, Devin, as a colleague and as a friend, actually, and to anyone else, because this is 2004, and I don't have the time, nor the desire, nor the inclination to explain certain things, or to justify or defend why there needs to be an apology by the United States government, why the question of reparations is a legitimate question in this country, and to understand someone who says, with all due respect to you, John, I've never had an opportunity to talk to black people about some of these things. I can only think that I probably speak for a lot of black people in this country who probably have similar feelings. And so when you say, well, I'm worried about the political correctness, I'm afraid that if I bring this up, I'm going to offend somebody and everything, I can't help you with that. The reality is what it is. Right. In this country.
But on the other hand, but on the other hand of the equation, the reality is what it is in the white community, and nothing's happened for 30 years.
Not my problem.
It is your problem.
No, it is not my problem.
Sorry.
So we don't.
Important to point out everybody thought Emory was really under control. Yeah. That's good. Important to point out, though, the post-dinner growth that has occurred, because you have come to realize it is your problem. Exactly. It is my problem. I mean, clearly, you people are my problem. Well, next week, we're going to mark the 15 years since we launched that conversation. How far have we come in our ability to talk about race in America? Join us for that next Sunday morning. Until then, Meet the Press is next. Have a great week, and we'll see you next time for Flashpoint.